Well, good morning. As mentioned earlier, and for the observant amongst you, I'm not blonde, I'm not female, and therefore my name isn't Steph. I have to apologise that Stephanie couldn't be with us here today. She's had to stay in London for an ongoing investigation back in London. I'm going to be with you now probably for the next 20 minutes or so. I'm aware that I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch. I'll try and keep this as swift as possible. My name is James Danvers. I'm a senior analyst at the United Kingdom's Child Exploitation and Online Protection Centre. And over the period of time, I'm going to be talking to you about online child sexual exploitation. So more specifically, first of all, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to CEOP, who we are and what you do, so you have a bit of a context as to what perspective I'm coming to on this from. Next, I'm going to kind of give you a quick introduction as to how we define and how we describe online CSE, and why it is that it's important that we use accurate and quite specific language to describe this type of criminality. And then I'm going to go into a little bit more detail around the methodology that some offenders are using online at the moment, the prevalence with which we're seeing online CSE grow, before then moving on to a case study to illustrate some of the points that I've made, and then finally finishing off with a few concluding remarks about the response which we have both in UK law enforcement and law enforcement more broadly. So by way of a quick introduction then, CEOP is part of UK law enforcement. We're a law enforcement body. At the moment we're a department of the Serious Organised Crime Agency, and next month we're due to transition to the United Kingdom National Crime Agency. Both next month and now we benefit from having a multidisciplinary staff. So we have police officers from regional forces, we have people from the Serious Organised Crime Agency, and in order to support those individuals we also have secondees from charities and non-governmental organisations in order to give that experience of working first-hand with children on the front line. Our job and the job of those staff is to protect children in a number of respects. We're there to protect them online, offline, from contact and non-contact child sexual offending. And as with our partners in other departments across SOCA, we're generally there to deal with the more complicated cases that regional UK police forces couldn't deal with in their own right. What that really means is effectively we deal with cases that cross jurisdictional boundaries, whether those boundaries are within UK regions or if those boundaries are in fact international ones. CEOP this year has 4 key threats, one of which is online child sexual exploitation. The other 3, which I'll briefly mention, are the proliferation of indecent images of children, which other people sometimes call child sexual abuse material or child pornography. The sexual exploitation of children overseas by UK offenders, which is probably more commonly known as travelling sex offenders. And then lastly, contact child sexual exploitation within the UK. The reason I bring this slide up and mention it in particular is that whenever you have an online, or whenever we have an online case to deal with, the chances are that offender is involved in more than one form of offending. And particularly with the case of online sexual exploitation, the chances are that an offender is also involved in the proliferation and spreading of indecent images of children. So in terms of terminology then, what am I actually talking about when I talk about online CSE, online child sex exploitation? Well, the first thing I'll say is what it isn't, and what it isn't is online grooming. For us, online grooming refers to quite a narrow subset of online CSE, where an adult builds a relationship, an exploitative relationship with a child over a long period of time, abuses the trust of that child, and then has a view to meeting them in person, face-to-face, and contact abusing against them. When we're talking about online CSE, we're talking about a far broader range of threats which children could face from adults online. And what we're really talking about is instances where offenders will either coerce, or otherwise elicit self-generated indecent images from children against their wishes. Motivation for this is almost always sexual, but we have seen cases where there is an element of financial motivation to it as well, where once an offender has obtained images of a child, they'll then use the release of that image to blackmail either the children themselves or their parents or family for personal financial goal. So methodology then. Although each investigation, each case is different, there are a couple of common themes which run throughout all of them. First of which is victim selection. An offender will first off need to find their victims from somewhere. That somewhere is often social networking sites. Offenders will often go to these sites, go through individuals' profiles and try and find children who they believe have some kind of pre-existing vulnerability. That vulnerability is not always, but is often, risk-taking behaviour. And by that I mean instances of children perhaps becoming involved in quite sexualised chat on their profiles, or posting fairly provocative images of themselves in their photographs. Once an offender has identified who they perceive to be a vulnerable victim, they'll then make an approach. Sometimes that approach will be under the guise of some kind of online alias. The kind of stereotypical example, if not always the accurate example, is an older male pretending to be a young female. However, that isn't always the case. Aliases can take many forms, and in fact, in a number of our investigations, what we've seen is offenders being fairly blunt and upfront with children from the outset as to who they are and what their intentions are, and conversations very, very quickly escalating from something which is relatively innocent at an outset to something which is a highly sexualised conversation in really the space of minutes, if not under a minute in some extreme cases. If at this initial stage of contact a child proves fairly resilient to that offender, in the majority of cases that offender will effectively cut their losses and move on to someone who they feel will be an easier target. What an offender is trying to do at an early stage is obtain a single indecent image of a child, potentially through a webcam, and once they have that single image, they can then use the threat of the release of that image either openly on the internet or specifically onto that child's social network profile page, or indeed to their friends or family via email, to leverage more and more images, and generally more and more increasingly sexually explicit images from that child. Because of the speed with which this can take place and the chat going from fairly innocent to fairly explicit very, very fast, what you often find is offenders will be targeting multiple victims at once. And this is quite an important departure from sort of traditional notions of online grooming, where a single offender would spend a long period of time invested in a single victim. We're now seeing offenders investing small amounts of time in multiple victims, and in fact building that relationship with multiple victims over quite a long period of time. Generally what we're talking about here is female children in their early to mid-teens, but we do see a number of cases where we have male victims and also victims who are considerably younger than their teenage years. Both these areas can be quite problematic for us for two reasons. Firstly, with male victims, they're far less likely to disclose either to their parents or their teacher or to the police that they've actually been a victim of exploitation and abuse. So although the figures you've got on the board there would illustrate that 20% of cases are male, that figure is probably far higher. It's simply a case of young males not feeling that they're able to disclose the case that they've been exploited online. And then the problem with young victims is simply as a result of their youth and inexperience in sort of the ways of the world, that they are far easier for an offender to manipulate, especially once that initial approach has been made and an offender has sort of got their claws into a victim online, so to speak. So that is the problem, but what is the prevalence of the problem? Well, last year CEOP had over 1,000 cases of online CSE reported to it in the UK, and of those 1,000, almost a third of those cases were assessed as having some kind of successful outcome for the offender. So a successful outcome, what we mean by that is either the offender has got self-generated indecent images from a child or has met them face-to-face and performed some kind of contact offence on that child. These figures represent an increase in the number of reports going into CEOP, but a decrease in the success rate. And the easiest way to surmise why that's taking place is what we call the scattergun effect, which is what I sort of alluded to slightly earlier, that offenders now are effectively mass mail blasting large numbers of children in the hope that some of them reply, rather than spending a large amount of time focusing on a small amount of children. So that new sort of silent methodology there, simply to net a large number of children against which they can start to offend. And the bottom point on that slide there, just really saying that increasingly this form of offending is about abuse and exploitation that is taking place purely within the online environment as a medium to offend, rather than as a prelude to any kind of contact face-to-face meeting. And in fact, in the majority of cases that we deal with, the offenders don't have any intention of meeting the children face-to-face. It's often too risky in terms of law enforcement attention and too logistically difficult for them to achieve. So they stick to mediums like webcams in order to actually conduct the abuse and exploitation that they're hoping to. So offending environments, you sort of see in offending environments generally what you'd expect based on young people's internet usage on the whole. The most common environment where an offender will make an approach to a child is a social networking site, but we shouldn't be too focused on that at the risk and the exclusion of other areas. Certain areas which, certainly for policemen perhaps slightly older than I to get their heads around, are slightly new areas of threat and emerging threats like voice over IP within online games consoles. So in fact not involving a laptop or a desktop or any sort of traditional, so to speak, computer usage in any way. Quite often through this what we see is webcams, although in addition to webcams you also have the use of mobile phones and picture messaging within phones, and of course I'll say traditional, but it's I suppose not that traditional in the context of time, but traditional emailing of photographs just within an email platform. What you'll generally see with investigations, which is perhaps quite interesting, is that offenders will try to pull a victim from a relatively public forum, say a social networking site, to increasingly more private forums, ending up with, for instance, text messaging or photo messaging on mobile phones, partly as a way of having greater access to their victims, and partly as a way of increasing what they perceive as their security when they're offending. So, to go through then what I've just gone through in theory, I'm going to run you through a quick case study of a fairly recent investigation which CEOP has been involved in fact so recent that it hasn't fully reached its conclusion, which is why I'll be slightly ambiguous about some of the areas of it. This case study started when CEOP received two strands of intelligence more or less simultaneously. One was from a social networking site that had concerns about suspicious activity by one of its users, and the second was a young boy who disclosed to his parents that he was being exploited online by an older male, and then those parents in turn going to the police, who in turn came to CEOP for some specialist expertise. It became quite clear at the outset what we were dealing with here was definitely an online CSE case where this offender was eliciting a single, relatively low level, albeit still indecent image of a child by a webcam, and then once they had that image, they used it as leverage in order to demand increasingly severe, increasingly frequent sexual acts by that child by webcam for their viewing. So, the primary objectives of CEOP from the outset here were really threefold. They were to stop the offender and stop further people becoming victims. It was to protect those children who had already become victims. And then thirdly, and quite importantly, was to bring that offender to justice. When we got into the sort of the meat of this investigation, it became quite clear that this was quite a chunky case to be dealing with. And the offender themselves was spread over a number of different online platforms, a number of different social networking sites. So the process started with us going to those sites and obtaining bulk data from them in order to start to narrow down where this offender might be operating from, and also by working back through his victims, working out where those victims are based in order to provide them with the protection that they needed. This heat map here shows, after a reasonably intensive amount of analysis, where victims were located for one offender globally. On the heat map you've got over 300 victims, and as you'll see they're spread over every continent except Antarctica. If there were kids in Antarctica, he'd probably have been offending against them there as well, to be frank. So quite a sight. As the investigation progressed, it became apparent that this offender was specifically targeting children across a number of continents so that he would have access to children at any time of the day or night, due to obviously the different time zones spreading across the globe. A snapshot then, just slightly closer in from the UK, and the UK victims. We had dozens of victims within the UK, and as a result, this investigation, which was being led almost solely by CEOP, became something far, far broader, involving multiple overseas police forces, as well as a considerable number of regional police forces within the UK. So what happened? Well, first of all, we found out that the offender himself was operating overseas and wasn't in the UK. When we narrowed down what country that was, we deployed a team overseas to support the local law enforcement, particularly on the technical side of computer analysis to help locate this offender. And thankfully, quite shortly after the deployment of the SOCA team and the CEOP team to that country, the offender was arrested and is currently in detention and is awaiting trial. In parallel with that process and the criminal justice system, also was the fairly lengthy process of identifying the victims and then offering the victims the support they need through social workers and child protection agencies in order to help psychologically get them over the ordeal which they'd been through. And by the time we'd in fact wrapped this case up and arrested the offender, there were a number of victims who were sadly self-harming and were in fact quite close to committing suicide, which is really quite a potent reminder to us that simply because an offence takes place within the online environment doesn't mean that there won't be real physical and very, very severe impacts on children in the real world. So, how can we stop cases like this taking place in the future? And if and when they do happen, how can we make sure that they're investigated as swiftly, efficiently and professionally as possible? From my perspective, there are 4 things which we can do. The first thing is quite specific for law enforcement, and that is we continue and in fact improve upon the cooperation which we've already got, and we grow it from, at the moment, sharing intelligence primarily around specific cases to growing it to a point where we're sharing intelligence more broadly around emerging threats, around new methodologies and techniques that offenders may be using, and then in turn new methodologies that we as law enforcement could be developing together in order to help tackle these threats going forward. Secondly, and as the case study quite nicely illustrated, the working relationship between law enforcement and social networking sites is absolutely crucial. In this case, we had an approach by a site, but also by a child as well. But had that child not have disclosed, there's a good chance that this investigation could have started anyway, because of the disclosure that was made by the social networking site that they were particularly suspicious about the activities of one of its users. And really, they can be there to help be a bit of an early warning to us when something suspicious is going on. Thirdly, you have preventative measures like international child protection certificates. I won't go into that now, mainly because it's quite long and you're probably all, as I am, quite hungry. But on the CEOP website, there's plenty of information about those should you wish to delve further into some of those checks and measures which we can put on people before they are in a position where they can contact children either online or face-to-face and in person. And lastly, but certainly not least, is education. And education really is the key to this. Preventing crimes is better than investigating crimes, well, that would put me out of a job. But really the message for online CSE is twofold, and it's fairly simple. One, getting across to children, when you're online, keep your clothes on. You don't know who the person at the other end of the email or the instant messenger or the webcam is. And secondly, if you do find yourself in a position where you're uncomfortable and you think that things are going down a bad road in a very short space of time, letting children know that there are agencies that they can go to if they're not comfortable perhaps with going to their parents or their schools. So, in conclusion then, what we've seen from CEOP over recent years is a move from traditional notions of grooming, where you're focused on one child, to more of a scattergun approach, where offenders are targeting en masse large numbers of children with the express purpose of leveraging self-generated indecent images from them. The motivator for this is almost always sexual, but we shouldn't exclude the possibility of financial, which from a police perspective then gives you an interesting avenue of investigation, which is the quite traditional one of following the money. And lastly, I sort of really want to finish on the point that online CSE is definitely as important as contact offending in the real world, and the physical effects on children, both psychologically and physically, if they get to the point where they're looking to commit suicide, is something very real and something which is a responsibility for all of us. And in cases where that is taking place, we require a layered response both in the UK and internationally, and between police and other agencies like charities to best support victims. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take questions now, or equally happy to talk over lunch, whatever people would prefer.